Yeah, so a little bit of a tangent. I hope you find it interesting. A bit of a plug for what I'm doing late tomorrow afternoon. We're running a session on disaster waste planning, and when we put that together I noticed there was a gap and offered to talk about some other things that I was involved with, and there is a bit of a relationship which hopefully you'll pick up by the end of the presentation. But what I want to talk about today is the demolition part of construction and demolition, and give you some examples of some work that we've been involved with in New Zealand, and there's some unique drivers of that activity that are giving us some interesting challenges and also some interesting opportunities. And I guess the key lesson I hope you'll go away with in about 10 or 15 minutes is that there's quite a bit of devil in the detail, and that's what we're grappling with at the moment. So what am I talking about? There's a whole lot of buildings that we don't want anymore. So what on earth are we going to do with those? And they might be houses of some description, and they might actually be much larger structures. And we're dealing with projects that cover both of those. I'll talk a little bit later about a land clearance project that Tonkin and Taylor is in alliance with a number of other organisations with. We were tasked with removing about 7,000 houses to make space for about 25,000 new ones to deal with some of the housing shortages in Auckland. We've also had some involvement with a number of commercial buildings in Wellington that are, as a result of an earthquake several years ago, have been deemed as no longer safe to occupy. So as you work through things like an insurance and so on, so eventually you get to a point where it's time to remove those buildings. So both of those have different implications. And there's a hierarchy of options which matches the waste hierarchy. So fundamentally the ideal is that you reuse. So in terms of those houses, potentially there's an opportunity to relocate those buildings. We need the space to put more dense housing on so we can't reuse on site. There might be an opportunity to recover components. There may be an opportunity to recover materials. And if none of those tick the boxes, then you might start to look at whether you can recover those materials for energy and so on. So if we look at those housing removals in Auckland, then the default is to drop those with a digger, take them off for sorting, and a good 85% of that material will go into a process engineered fuel, fundamentally into a cement kiln, the only cement kiln in New Zealand. So that's not a bad option, but we think there's probably better options for some of the materials in those buildings, and that's what we're hunting at the moment. If you look at the Wellington example, then the default option is to drop that material and capture aggregate, and actually it comes in handy for things like reclaiming damaged wharf materials and things like that. So there are some possibilities there, but again it's about, are there higher value use for these materials? So what we're trying to do here is bring a circular economy mindset rather than a waste management mindset. It's all about maximising the value of what we've got on our hands rather than minimising the cost of dealing with it. The other thing that's worth probably just noting from a New Zealand context is perhaps a little bit different to parts of Australia. Our cost of disposal, particularly for materials that aren't going to municipal waste sites, can be very, very low. So in a place like Wellington, it might be $20 or $30 a cubic metre to get rid of material, so it's just almost nothing. We also have a highly regulated building sector, and that's driven by seismic risk. We've had the odd earthquake, as you probably know, over the last wee while, and that's driven some pretty strict building standards and also a lot of attention to design and liability associated with design on behalf of engineers and constructors. Historically, a little bit further back, we've also had issues with weather tightness, so that brings a lot of quite tight regulation when you're talking about the building envelope. So that has some implications if you're talking about recovering materials and then trying to bring them back into the building sector, because you need to be able to deliver on the tight standards that we have in place. And we're also a pretty small place. We've got quite a tightly integrated building supply chain, so that's quite heavily dominated by a relatively small number of players. So that means if you've got alternative building materials, that can be challenging to get them back in. So the next couple of slides, I just want to talk about what the drivers are for different players in the demolition or the removal space. So I use the word diverters, but I guess I'm talking about, there's probably two groups in this space. One is the owners of the buildings, and the others are the contractors or the organisations tasked with actually removing those materials. And all of these drivers play out for them to varying degrees. But chances are the people who are actually tasked with physically removing buildings have put in the lowest price, because that's usually the way these things are procured. They're also probably committed to a timeline which is probably aggressive and slightly optimistic, if you've ever been involved in a project like this. Depending on who the organisation is, they'll probably have some desire to maintain or enhance reputation and engage with their surrounding community, and certainly the owners, particularly if they're public sector, will. Health and safety is clearly a very strong driver across both the contractors and the owner parties. And in some cases, there's a real interest in actually driving jobs. Just to pick out the health and safety one, one of the buildings that we've been involved in some discussions with in Wellington was severely damaged in the Kaikoura earthquake about 3 years ago. It's taken a couple of years to settle insurance. We went on a walkthrough on that building to see if we could identify components that might be recoverable. Building was very much jacked to stay up. There was some pretty spectacular movement in that building that you probably wouldn't be comfortable with if you'd seen. At the end of that walkthrough, we had another earthquake. And I was with a bunch of big burly construction blokes, but we all were pretty keen to get out of the building and get away from the building. So from a health and safety perspective, when you're talking about recovery in that type of context, you're actually, in the real world, you're balancing up the desirability of recovering materials versus putting people at risk, and actually real risk, not just theoretical risk. So that's the people who are actually generating materials, if you like, through a demolition project or a removal project. You've also got people who actually might be looking at reusing materials, and you probably get people's attention if you can put materials into the market at a lower cost. One of the big drivers in New Zealand, and I think from a brief discussion I had on the way to the conference this morning, it sounds like it's similar here. Native timbers, hardwoods are a really, really valuable material that you can get. And in places like Auckland, we've got companies who will purchase older houses specifically to get their hands on native timbers that they can refurbish and then put back into the marketplace. That's driven by the fact that they look pretty cool, but it's also driven by the fact that they are in relatively short supply. One of the challenges, as I said, is this whole issue around standards. So it's all very well to take recovered materials, pull them back into the construction sector for aesthetics, but if you want to start to do things with your building envelope or you want to do something structurally, you're going to have a really hard process to actually get those certified to the same level that you would have for virgin products. And as I said, in New Zealand, we have a very integrated, vertically integrated construction sector, so we've got a very well-established supply chain, so it's quite challenging to break into there. Things like Green Star and ISCA also have some impact from a reuser's perspective as well. So the opportunities, no real rocket science in the first one. If you can pull out materials and get a lot of money for them, then it makes a lot of sense. So the native timbers are the real driver of deconstruction activity that has been done in New Zealand, and I assume it was very similar here. The concept of pre-trading is starting to get a little bit of traction in New Zealand. So this is about actually understanding what is in your building and making sure that you don't invest effort in recovering that until you're actually confident that you've got an end game for it. So when you're talking about a major commercial building, that could be something like, say, a kitchen or something like that that's still of pretty good value, but might be no point in pulling it out carefully if no one's actually going to take it off your hands. Your HVAC kit, all of your M&E kit, those sorts of things, a lot of value in that material, not as scrap, but actually as M&E kit. But no point in going in there and pulling it out very carefully if no one's going to take it off your hands. You don't want to chuck it in a warehouse and put it onto eBay and desperately hope that someone's going to give you some money for it. So the little app that I've shown there's a little startup in Auckland called CivilShare, who've put together an app. It was actually driven by the fact that in the construction sector, what often happens is you get a load of concrete and you've got a half a metre left over at the end, and you've got about half an hour to make use of that, or it's useless. So that's all about trading those sorts of resources. It's about saying, hey, I've got some guys, I've hired them for 2 weeks, but I don't need them for the next 2 days. Does anyone else want to use them? Or I've got a digger and I only need it 3 days this week, that sort of conversation. They're now starting to think about materials trading as well. And part of the model that they're talking about is actually going into a building and understanding what's there and then listing and only going and recovering those materials if someone's expressed an interest in it. So again, invest the effort where you're actually going to get a return. So we're starting to see in the discussion around the removal of houses in Auckland, where we've got a large number of them, is the concept of relocation and refurbishment with an opportunity for job and skills training. So a lot of this is driven by land availability to the north of Auckland and to the south of Auckland, where we've got rural communities, relatively low value housing, reasonably easy to get your hands on labour and land. So certainly there's some possibilities in there. The question is, how do we kind of join those dots and match up the expectations and the risks that you're trying to manage as a deconstructor or a remover of houses with some of the risks that you might hit when you're actually trying to recover materials. So fundamentally what we're talking about is trying to achieve a circular economy within the construction sector. So I'm talking about demolition or removal, but the ideal is that we actually cycle those materials back into the construction sector. So we've all seen this beautiful circle, but we also know that as soon as you break one of those links, then it gets then materials end up going off to disposal or to a lower value use, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So partly that's about the people who are removing buildings or deconstructing buildings, partly it's about the designers, partly it's about the people that are procuring. So it could happen anywhere in that chain. It's not really rocket science. And a lot of what we're grappling with at the moment is where in that chain is the breakage occurring, and it's probably multiple areas, but we're trying to focus in on that. So I just want to talk to you really quickly about a couple of projects that we've got some involvement with. When I put in this abstract, I thought particularly for this one that we'd have some really, really great stories about how we were starting to ramp up at scale. And what we're finding is actually the moving parts continue to move, and we're trying to pull it together. So this is the one I mentioned earlier on, largely government-owned houses across 5 different precincts in Auckland. About 7,000 of them. A lot of those are quite old, which in New Zealand means they're made with native timbers. So there's a lot of really, really valuable timber in there. Some of the newer ones are made with pretty low value timber, so that's a little bit more challenging. And the structure that I'm part of is a commercial alliance to deliver clear land that will then be allocated to a number of developers to develop a mix of commercial or private houses and social housing. So there's certainly commercial pressures on us as an alliance, and there's timeline pressures to remove those houses to allow others to move forward on that. So I was telling one of the guys in my office in Wellington, where I'm based, about this project and how we had all these houses and we were looking at amazing native timbers and cool windows and a whole lot of components, and he was like, yeah, no, I get exactly what you're talking about. The other day I was riding home from work through Wellington and I saw these guys were pulling an old old house to pieces, and they'd just taken a whole lot of the windows and they'd put them in the skip. So I went in and said, can I grab a couple of those windows, please? And I said, yeah, that's fine. So he came back and grabbed a carload, and he's building a cool little greenhouse out the back of his place with a whole lot of really quite gorgeous windows. And I said, well, that's fantastic. Would you be able to accommodate me for maybe 50 to 100,000 of those windows? Because that's pretty much the sort of numbers that we're dealing with. And it's similar in the context of the sort of native timbers that we're dealing with. So as I said, those native timbers are of high value because they're great timber. They look really good when they're dealt with in the right way. But they're also high value because there's not a lot of them around. So as soon as you dump a lot of material onto the market, potentially you undermine your whole business case for deconstruction, which is a bit of a bugger, really. So that's one of the ones that we're trying to grapple with. One of the conversations we're having is how you might actually get some social enterprise components in there around reprocessing of those timbers, denailing, those sorts of things, so increasing the price, and also looking at moving those timbers outside of just Auckland to other parts of New Zealand. We've also got partners who are looking at the possibility of not so much deconstructing, but partly dismantling houses and then reassembling them elsewhere, either around New Zealand or even up in the islands. So on the way over here yesterday, I was talking to a couple going over to Tonga and asking them how the rebuild's going there after the cyclones just over a year ago. So there's certainly a need for buildings. Those 7,000 homes could be used if we could just find a sensible way of getting them somewhere. I think I've already talked about the dumpster diving at scale. I think that's a huge challenge for us and one that we're still grappling with. The other thing that's worth talking about in terms of the Purchas alliance and the process that we're running through there is that as an alliance we're tasked with delivering a cost-effective clearance of land in preparation for development for housing. If we were to move to much more of a deconstruction model, that's going to deliver great outcomes from a social perspective. It's going to deliver jobs. It's going to cycle materials through the economy, but it's going to cost us more. So from a commercial perspective, we're really struggling to make that work. And what we're grappling with at the moment is who's actually buying those social outcomes as opposed to us trying to deliver a commercial outcome. It's a real challenge in New Zealand, and I think what I've been hearing over today is that there's some similar challenges in some aspects of what we're trying to deliver from a social enterprise perspective as well. Who pays for each component and how do you stitch that into a sensible whole? So the other case study I thought it was worth talking about was commercial buildings. So several years ago there was a reasonably sizable earthquake in Kaikoura that had an impact across the top of the South Island of New Zealand, but also in Wellington. The one thing that's become really, really clear to me is that regardless what earthquake you design a building for, the earthquake that actually occurs will be materially different. So what's happened is that we've got a number of buildings within Wellington that have been quite severely damaged. And we've also learnt quite a bit about how buildings perform. So the building that I've got a picture of here is Wellington Central Library, quite an iconic building in the city. It's where I used to go to stay warm when I was a student quite some time ago. They've just recently, within the last couple of weeks, completed a reassessment of the structural integrity of that building from some of the lessons they've learnt around other buildings that failed in Wellington. And it's kind of a close run thing as to whether they're going to spend a lot of money on refurbishing, strengthening that, or that building may even end up coming down. The other building that we're involved with has been subject to insurance claims, so that was settled about 6 months ago. And so finally we're now in a position where we can start to pull that down. As I said, the default position is that we will drop that building and recover aggregate, which is okay, but we think there's actually some other things that we could do in there. So a really interesting opportunity that I'm playing around with at the moment is it's an office building, about 5 stories, was for a high-end commercial organisation, so pretty nice fit out. They had a couple of lovely kitchens on every floor. So it's pretty gutting to go through this building and see these beautiful kitchens that are only about 5 years old. Just so happens that I've got a friend who's doing a development that has got a similar number of apartments and has got a bit of an environmental angle to the way that they're trying to pitch that. So we've started some conversations to see whether we can effectively pre-sell those kitchens, so it's actually worth pulling those materials out. I talked earlier on about M&E kit. You go up into the plant room in that building and you've got this pristine boiler and associated equipment. I've never seen anything so shiny in my life. Designed bespoke for that building, but on the face of it, that's going to become scrap steel. So again, one of the opportunities that we're hunting around for is finding someone who feels like they're creative enough to actually design an HVAC system around available equipment rather than design an HVAC system and then have bespoke equipment for each building. Insurance is a key issue, and you'll hear a bit more about that probably when we talk about disaster waste tomorrow. I think the interesting thing about this earthquake damage scenario is it just demonstrates the sort of tail that you've got from some natural disasters in terms of waste material being generated. And obviously the driver for these people is also getting materials, getting the site cleared so they can actually move forward on that. So where to from here for us as we grapple with trying to get this stuff moving forward, recognising that there's a whole lot of challenges. I think if you look at the opportunity in Auckland, one of the real challenges we've got is a lot of people have deconstructed a house. There's even a few people who've deconstructed a few houses. But we've yet to find anyone who has done more than a few houses, and we're looking for probably 100 houses a month, 50 to 100 houses a month. So it's just a completely different scale. How do you address that capability? Then you've got the market issues if you do actually manage to get your hands on material. I think what's really clear is it requires a whole lot of players, and this is a really consistent message when you think about circular economy in a much broader sense. You can't just have 1 or 2 people in the room. You've got to get a whole lot of people pushing in the same direction. So it's all about communication, and then more communication, and then more communication. And if I go back to the commercial driver we've got for Purchas, that starts to become a really expensive exercise, so that's what we're grappling with at the moment. Every project's a little bit different, so you do need to invest effort in understanding exactly what the drivers, the opportunities are at a specific level. And this issue of how do we deal with commercial outcomes, which is probably the guys with the diggers. The people who are doing the physical work will be very much driven by dollars and contracts and the broader things that they've got to deliver under that, versus other agencies who might be delivered in much broader outcomes. And I guess the message that we've been working on selling within our alliance, with some of the partners that we're dealing with, whether it's Purchas or examples in Wellington, is we're not actually asking people to spend more money. We're asking people to spend their money in a slightly different way and to achieve slightly different outcomes. And we're starting to get some traction. So sorry for the tangent. I hope that's some useful things to ponder on over your afternoon cup of tea.